Sheikh is the curator and writer who researches practices of exhibition making and political imaginaries. He is reader in art and program director of the MFA in curating at Goldsmiths, University of London. Sheikh was coordinator of the critical studies program at Malmö Art Academy from 2002 to 2009. He was also curator at NIFCA in Helsinki from 2003 to 2004, and prior to that, director of Overgarden Institute for Contemporary Art in Copenhagen. Between 1996 and 2000, he was editor of the magazine Øjeblikket and before a member of the project group Globe. His recent curatorial work includes Reading Capital for Althusser at Dipu in Istanbul, that was 2014, Unauthorized and Inter-Arts Lab in Malmö in 2012, All That Fits, the Aesthetic of Journalism at Quad in Derby in 2011, a project he curated together with Alfredo Cramerotti. Then in St. Petersburg in 2011, the exhibition Do You Remember the Future? Or at BAC in the Basis for Aktuelle Kunst in Utrecht in 2010, Vectors of the Possible. And tonight he's going to talk about the Academy in Peril, intellectual labor between liberty and liberalization. So I'm very happy that you are here.
Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. I think part of what I will talk about today is from the perspective of working within education and what exactly these terms that we just talked about before, actually, the liberal tradition and the notion of neoliberalism, how they kind of affect how one works. Both, I think, as an educator, but also as a student. And I feel slightly guilty because I think whenever one speaks in old Europe, coming from the United Kingdom, you are always the bearer of bad news. Because I think in this wave of basically dismantling what used to be a social state that is happening all over Europe, of course, has its inspiration in certain tendencies in the United States, but they are always translated into Europe and the European Union through the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom has a particularly bad influence, I think, on the European community. So when we talk about visible and invisible infrastructures. Moreover, I'll try and talk about, well, 3 different points, because I realized you're always trying to think, you know, when you're invited to do these talks, what is it that they want from me, you know, what they want me to talk about. I was thinking, do they want me to talk about things that I've already written about, and what should I talk about again? And I have often I'm asked to talk from this point of view of education, the potentiality, the political potentiality of emancipation in education, the value of knowledge production in art, artistic practice, artistic research, or I'm asked to talk about the notion of the public sphere and what that could mean. So I realized, actually preparing that in this case, I would have to talk about both, which I don't know if that filled me with some horror, but nonetheless I then feel the need to sort of revisit some positions that I've had, perhaps naively, and try and see that what it actually means to be working as a thoroughly institutionalized person. Right, so when I speak here, I speak under my own proper name, but as we also heard from the introduction, with that follows all sorts of other inscriptions. One of them being that I work in a specific university, and in a way, regardless of how I think about it, this is something we discuss a lot, and I guess it has to do with academic freedom also. I discuss with colleagues, not just in my university, but elsewhere. Can you not speak on behalf of the university? And I think that's impossible, actually. I think that to say that I would not speak on behalf of my university would be a kind of intellectual grandstanding. That structure always speaks through me, and vice versa. So maybe a little bit of context, of course, on why these debates have a certain, a kind of specific urgency, I think, and have had that in the UK, is of course that to think of the university as a public institution in the British context is no longer possible, except in a very idealistic way, perhaps nostalgic, which might be again recalling the liberal tradition, perhaps for other political means, but that would be a polemical move in order to create a change. Because economically, the universities have been completely privatized. But at the same time, of course, they don't function like a private company. They function as a private business in the sense that they are completely marketized and that it requires business planning as much as academic planning and research planning to run a university. But at the same time, even though we have been liberated from the state in that way, and we get no state funding whatsoever, we don't have the freedom that any of us would have if we started our own company. So there's a strange contradiction there between the so-called notion of liberty, the free market, and actually what neoliberal reform produces. Because at the same time where we are now completely dependent on either outside funding in terms of research or patronage, but in the main student fees, which would transform again our public role into one of service provision for students. We are being even more regulated than before. So on the one hand, there is the severance from the point of view of the state of the economy, the economic flow, to what used to be state-run institutions. And then at the same time, there's more government control in terms of the content and the policies of these institutions, both in terms of our research and what is now even called officially our knowledge production, interestingly. We've just been asked in our next strategic planning for the next 5 years as a department to also describe what is our planned knowledge production in that time. Interestingly. So actually the new liberalism produces more control and not less control. So it gives you less economy, gives you the freedom of the market, but at the same time controls what you're doing even more. So there is in that sense, certainly new liberalism in one way has not very much to do with the liberal tradition of thought, but should go under another name, which is the name of governmentality. Moreover, it's important then to talk a little bit about the economic situation in terms of the student body. As you may have known, there were great protests against the tuition hikes that occurred a few years ago when it was decided that the universities in the UK should be working from a private business model in terms of its economy. And there was this idea that there was a maximum tuition fee, and then universities of a lower standing could then offer a cheaper degree. Now, of course, no self-respecting university would consider itself to be, giving you discounts. Nobody wanted to be the Aldi of universities. Everybody wanted to be the most fancy luxury supermarket in Lafayette. So what happened was that everybody immediately charged the maximum fees. Moreover, of course, there were two things that happens with the student funding, because when the tuition fees were introduced originally, which was actually by the new Labour government of Tony Blair, So not even Margaret Thatcher ever dared introduce tuition fees. When his government introduced them, they were, the argumentation was that you would get a state guaranteed loan with an extremely low interest rate, and if you're, for example, unemployed, you would not really be required to ever pay it back. Right? So there was extremely favorable loan systems, which would then take some of the heat off state spending that you could then use for other things, such as healthcare. Of course, it was used for the military in May, as always, which is the only place where austerity measures are not implemented. And of course, in many ways, this would seem quite like a fair model, that you would then get these loans, which really does not disenable anybody from attending university. Of course, what has now happened is that the current government has discontinued these loans for master's degrees, which means that you can only get it for a bachelor's degree. And this is a specific kind of British class policy, class warfare, you could say, from the upper echelons of society. So whereas the Blair government's ideas was to implement people in society as debtors, meaning that you would have a stake then in the banking system and in society as a debtor, and therefore think more entrepreneurial, think of your own economy in a more entrepreneurial sense from the moment that you're a student. The current idea is to have the masses have short educations and come quickly into the job market, and those who will work in leadership, namely those with MAs and even more so with PhDs in whatever discipline, would only be those who come from families where they can either get the credit or get the money from their parents. Basically like Cameron and David Cameron, his friends who all went to Oxbridge and at a PPE. So these are the two sort of elements. One is to inscribe everybody in a liberal economy from the student time onwards, and the other one is to prevent most people from taking longer educations, both directly and indirectly. So this is of course a big change from basically the traditional idea of what people have called the multiversity rather than university, which is the model of education that was built up not only in former Western Europe but also in the United States in the post-World War II period, which was to make sure that education was available for as many groups of society as possible. So we see that there is now a retrenchment from that model. The same way, of course, there's retrenchment from so many other aspects of the former welfare states. This, of course, also means that the role of teaching itself changes and the role of intellectual labor changes. As I said, it's presumed that we will be service providers. And of course, it functions that way very directly. So, for example, the program that I direct, we have targets of students that we have to reach every year. And if we do not reach those targets, let's say over a period of 3 or 4 years, then we would have to shrink the program or radically change it to make it more attractive to students. And shrinking it means that we have to lay off some of the staff, right? So myself or one of my colleagues would have to leave because there is a direct correlation between the number of students and our salaries. So I think that is, of course, to an extent quite different from the quota system that we have in most of the European universities, where the quotas are there enforced by governments in order to direct the flows of what is considered societal useful educations or less useful educations, and to try and prevent, for example, that too many people study in the humanities. Now here we have, of course, the strange irony. So these changes in the funding structure that basically has gone from research profile into student recruitment in the UK universities, and the defunding directly and indirectly of master's programs have led to a huge panic, and has led to the universities trying to think all sorts of ways in which they can maintain or not maintain. In some cases there are programs that are being discontinued because they don't attract students. But in other cases, which is in our case, or which is happening in our case, we don't have a problem with student recruitment. So there we actually have a type of freedom that we wouldn't have. That's where Mauricio Lazzarato's interesting provocative remark that liberalism produces control but also freedom comes into play. And we can discuss, of course, what kind of freedom it is. But if we were to say we want to educate more and we could attract the students, the college would be extremely happy. So they wouldn't say, are you sure there are enough jobs for all these young curators? Now, so it's up to us then to have that ethical stance of saying how many do we think that it's responsible to educate. So that becomes an individual, if you will, or departmental decision, where the economic pressure is actually to take more. So at my university they have now increased the number of students that they take with 500 across the college every year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually what it means is that access to the library is extremely difficult. So students, if they're not there at 8 o'clock in the morning, they cannot get a seat in front of any of the computers in the library, of course, because the only extension that happens is in academic staff. Everything else remains the same. So, moreover, presumably, this is the story that we know, I think, the commercialization of education is, in terms of intellectual labor, supposed to produce a culture of conformity that is decisively hostile to the university's traditional role, right, of being exactly the place for liberal theory, or a haven for informed social, aesthetic, and political critique. And in this context, it would seem, and this is particularly the case, of course, in the United States, academic freedom is becoming a luxury, not a condition of possibility for any sort of pursuit of truth. Knowledge production driven by market forces that reflect this hierarchy of power is supposed to slowly restructure institutions of higher learning by promoting certain areas of research, certain lines of inquiry, and conversely, of course, quietly burying others. So certain things gain valency, other things don't, both through a notion of what you can get research funding for, but even more so in terms of market idea of what kind of field can you attract students to. So over time, this process of course becomes hegemonic in the sense that unwritten rules about what's fundable and what is not bureaucratically internalized and modalities of self-censorship act as a filter for accepting or rejecting various research proposals, teaching methods, and even more so, let's say, the external public utterings and debates, which is this, again, liberal fantasy of the public intellectual, right? That you, as an intellectual, can speak outside of the institution and partake in a democratic culture and contribute to democratic culture through your knowledge. And like I said, I don't think that it's possible to really separate between the institutional voice and my own. The most kind of extreme criticism of this we find in the educational theorist Henry A. Giroux work, who has in the last 2 years published 2 very interesting books, which both have the notion of war in their title. They're based, of course, on the US-American system, but nonetheless, his book from 2013 is simply called The War on Youth, which I think is a very apt description of what's happening in terms of funding and possibilities for students. And the other one he simply calls neoliberalism's war on higher education. And that I think I would modify a little bit and say that there is only there is a war not on higher education as such, but on the multiversity model of higher education. But he also wrote then that he sees the task one has, political task, as an educator, and we could say as a cultural producer perhaps, is to combat what he calls the new illiteracy. This is in his book, a very interesting book called Zombie Culture, where he says that the new illiteracy is about more than not knowing how to read the book or the word, as we now just saw a lot of books virtually. It is about knowing how to read the world. The challenge it poses in a democracy is one of both learning how to reclaim literacy so as to be able to narrate oneself and the world from a position of agency. But it is also about unlearning those modes of learning that internalize modes of ignorance based on the concerted effort to know, be self-reflective, and as he says, act with principled dignity. And I think that this indicates a certain, of course, idea or model of learning which has to do not only with discipline but also with emancipation. And of course, the whole idea of making students be more entrepreneurial and have debts, even if they may not be large debts, you can then regulate the number of debts, comes of course out of the whole ideology and societal transformation of neoliberalism. Famously, of course, Margaret Thatcher said, so again would reject even the liberal tradition, there is no such thing as society. But of course it comes from both right-wing think tanks of the early 1970s that wrote reports on the university system in the United States and said that the universities, the campuses, were the biggest threat to the American model of enterprise culture. So a systematic reconfiguration of the universities, basically from the whole architecture of campuses to how curriculums were made, and not so much, as people tend to think, who gets fired, but actually more who gets hired, was started. And moreover, of course, in the economic model of neoliberalism that was implemented by the Reagan and Thatcher regimes of the 1980s, the idea was exactly to bring people into a system of debt that will then make them part of the system, the banking system, in a different way than in the opposition between the classes that had characterized the Fordist era of production. So, whereas of course Marx famously wrote that the workers have nothing to lose but their chains, the idea with the consumer society of neoliberalism was that people will have nothing to lose but their debts, which is of course a whole other proposition. So the interesting idea, we could say, is that of course in the 1980s, working with certain economists, the conundrum was, how do we make people spend more without making them richer? Right? If you don't want to redistribute wealth, but you want people to spend more, so then to increase productivity and so on, the only way is to give them access to credits. This is of course what led to the credit crisis that we had, and it's interesting with economic models. I'll talk a little bit about what a kind of discursive formation is in terms of knowledge production and from the angle of Michel Foucault in a minute. But the interesting thing, if you look at economic models, which tend to be very scientific and academic, you will see that an economic model used by economists and therefore by politicians is used until the day that it stops working. So it doesn't need to be proven. Whereas in other sciences and of course in culture, you always need to prove the use value of it. An economic model is actually followed almost religiously until the day that it breaks down. And of course at this moment, this is part of the crisis that I think it's been described as a crisis of the left, and I think it's true. It's a crisis of the left in responding to the economic crisis, not in a meaningful way, I would say, but in a way of creating a new imaginary, a new horizon of political possibility in a future society. But even more so, it's actually a crisis, of course, of the right, because they had implemented an economic model that's not sustainable. And they don't have another answer. So at the moment, austerity measures is used, but they actually don't have an answer to how to increase productivity and separate the bad debts from the good debts, which I think is interesting. So just to wrap up this first section, when we talk about academic freedom, it's of course very important to be specific about the institution and the kind of activity in question and the location of the individual within this institution. Again, Marcell already talked about the differences that one would see between California, the Balkans, Germany, and so on. And it matters, of course, what kind of institution we are talking about, right? Are we talking about a private institution or a public institution? So, like I would argue, even though we are publicly regulated, and you can't start your own university, principally, we are nonetheless at the same time completely private in terms of our economy. And then, of course, even so, you must then talk about if we are privatized as universities, are we working with a not-for-profit model or a profit model? And more, of course, we have to discuss in terms of knowledge production and these issues, of course, also of legality, who is authorized and who is not authorized to give degrees, award titles, issue certificates and licenses and so on. Which types of knowledge are circulating as authorized knowledges and which are circulating as unauthorized knowledges. So, I will now talk a bit about knowledge production, then a little bit about the public, and finally about the entanglement between these ideas of the public and the non-public, let's say. So, in the knowledge economy, as it's now called, education of course plays an important role, not just as a commodity in itself, the way I just described in my working situation, but also as a measure of constant de-skilling and redistribution of labor power. And of course, what politicians are now doing in their strange merger between a neoliberal hegemony, which is supranational, and a maintenance of the nation state, be it a welfare state or otherwise, is the constant talk of lifelong education as a new mode of being, which can also be translated into a constant substitution into language as economy, or to use Paulo Vierno's term, into formativity, virtuosity, general intellect, and political. Seen in this light, the educational role of artistic production, or of art institutions, such as exhibition places as this one, needs to be re-examined in terms of a knowledge economy, as in terms of how it produces, it sees the relationship between knowledge and power, or we could say knowledge and discipline. Now, writing about knowledge, Michel Foucault once stated that knowledge is that which one can speak of in a discursive practice. So this is interesting when we're talking about what is sanctified knowledge and not sanctified knowledge, right? Because it's not, his definition would be knowledge. It's not a question of saying whether it's in a book form or an artistic form. It's something that we can speak of in terms of a discursive practice. So it is the space in which the subject may take up a position and speak of the object with which he deals in his discourse. And it is the field of coordination and subordination of statements in which concepts appear and are defined, applied, and transformed. And finally, this is in this very difficult book, The Archaeology of Knowledge. Finally, knowledge is defined by the possibilities of use and appropriation offered by discourse. So offered by discourse. And by discourse here we also have to say that this is a system of recognition that can recognize forms of knowledge exactly as knowledge is. So it's not difficult, I think, to understand the setting of the speaker as a performer in this context, at once being in a language that gives validity to the performer's speech act, as well as speaking in a way and about objects that can be known by this language only, and thus always already guaranteeing this language its supremacy. So this also happens then when we're talking about something as art or art as knowledge. Right, so when we're speaking about knowledge production within art, or for that matter economy, knowledge economy, one cannot separate it from how it is produced, what it excludes and negates in order to produce, and how it is formed by discourse. As Foucault says, there is no knowledge without a particular discursive practice. So, regardless of whatever experimental and innovative metaphors for knowledge production that is employed, particularly within contemporary art and discussion of artistic research, what I won't go into today, it is nonetheless a matter of producing what Baudrillard would have called sign value. It's a rhetorical exercise. Furthermore, there is a relationship between the will to knowledge and the will to truth, as Foucault puts it, since the production of truth always requires an alteration of knowledge and its institutions. So, in other words, and Judith Butler has followed up on this, if we're talking about, for example, academic freedom, it has to be understood that that happens within a norm of professionalization that is historical. And actually one of the roles of a critical project would be to question those very norms. So in that sense, to say the Academy is in peril, I'm not only talking about neoliberal reform, but I'm also talking about a task of intellectual labor is to actually always put the Academy in danger. Because knowledge is not truth, but an instrument of discourse, and as such, subordinate, servile, and dependent. And here, famously, Foucault refers to Nietzsche's idea of knowledge rather than Aristotle's, where Aristotle sees a link between sensation and pleasure in the production of knowledge. Nietzsche typically, and darkly, sees knowledge not as a natural instinct, but as an invention that comes about through a mixture of pain and pleasure. Knowledge always hides its subconscious, fear, desire, impulse, and so on, and it is in the clash of these disparate instincts that knowledge is produced, rather than through harmony or a naturalist notion of cause and effect. And if knowledge can profess any truth, it is through the action of a primordial and renewed falsification that it establishes the distinction between the true and the untrue. This is again Foucault's words. The action of a primordial and renewed falsification. So interest or even ideology thus precedes the production of knowledge and conditions its scope and its alterations. So how then does changes happen in discursive formation, such as the university, or for that matter, artistic production? And here I think again Foucault has something interesting to offer. Because in the same book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, he writes about what then transforms a discursive practice. And he says the transformation of a discursive practice is tied to a whole, often quite complex set of modifications that may occur either outside of it. So the changes and modifications happen outside the discursive practice itself, in the forms of, he says, production, social relations, political institutions. This is of course what's happening then when politicians tell universities who are actually not interested in implementing changes that they have to implement changes. Or within the discursive practice itself. This of course happens more in the hard sciences than in art. It may happen in human sciences as well, but basically the techniques for determining objects in the refinement and adjustment of concepts, the accumulation of data and so on. So different types of truth regimes are installed, and in the natural sciences the tendency is that once there has been a new technique for determining objects, then the previous technique is relegated to history forever. It's cancelled. And of course we don't have that. We have the strange situation, let's say, in artistic production that any kind of new method of determination, be it in how we write about art or how we produce art, does not cancel out previous models. And then finally, it says that it can happen, change of a discursive practice can happen outside the practice, it can happen within its own methodology, it can also happen alongside it, so in other discursive practices. And this is probably, where we of course see changes happening. If we look at something like the discipline of art history, that tended to be very biographical, when there was the kind of post-structuralist breakthrough of people like Foucault and so on. In other human sciences, in philosophy, art history felt a certain need to change some of its methods. So in that case, it was neither from within or from outside, but rather something that happened alongside, parallel actually, often in the very same institutions, such as universities. But of course, universities are only the place where knowledge productions get authorized, right? And we here talked about the public library as something that makes that public, which public libraries no longer make public. So there's a kind of recapture, perhaps, politically, rhetorically, of, as Marcell said, the liberal thought itself. But I think there is something else at play, and that I've worked with is the notion not just of public formation, but that we have to think of not a unified public space, but one that's fragmented, completely fragmented, and in certain cases heavily antagonistic. And one of the models to think about this is to think not just of publics, but also of what Michael Warner, among others, have called counter-publics. Now, if we think of these, there are, of course, many cultural practices, not just archival practices, that you can call unauthorized. And I'm not here necessarily talking about whether they're legal or illegal, although often they may be illegal. But they may or may not go against official and sanctified cultural policy. They may happen in a completely parallel cultural formation. If you think of something as historically, of course, the very notion of fandom and fanzines, which is a kind of cultural production that, of course, doesn't require authorization, and nonetheless creates its own system of valorization. So this is a kind of vast field, I think, of positions and possibilities. Maybe we'll have time to discuss them over the next few days, ranging from the historical forms of so-called counterculture and alternative culture, but also current strategies, as we heard, of resistance and hacking, but also political exodus, as well as artistic positions that are secretive, underground, elitist, even, that do not try to be all-encompassing, that find itself in the figure of the amateur, or in the figure of the outsider, but also in elitist form. So there is, in my view, a kind of structural relationship between the outsider and the elitist in this idea that your public, as it's being defined through your mode of address, is by definition limited. That public address is by something that inscribes a very specific public, which may be very small or very large, but not the general public, not the general intellect. And in each of these very different instances, also with different politics, there is a shared concern, namely the attempt to establish a separate independent system of value and meaning, a system or discourse which do not require institutional validation, which does not suppose institutionalization as such, but rather its own often private forms of circulation and authorization. Again, a historical example, I think, within art would be something that I think precedes net art and not least post-internet art production, which is the strange phenomena of mail art. Because mail art, as it happened from the 1960s up to the mid-1980s, was a global phenomenon that united Eastern and Western Europe, artists living under dictatorship in Latin America, but also in the United States. But at the same time, it was that it was all-inclusive, principally. There was also no censorship. You can do whatever you wanted in mail art. There's absolutely no censorship. It was extremely elitist. Because if you didn't know anyone in the network, you couldn't be part of mail art. And you could not be a consumer or an audience in mail art. You could only participate in mail art as a producer by sending things in the mail art network and therefore receiving other things from other artists. So producer and consumer were one and the same. At the same time, there was this extreme artistic freedom, but there was also a kind of elimination of the very idea of being public. Now, of course, counterpublics, to find a little bit more, has historically been first from Knecht and Kluge and later on from Michael Warner, coming from respectively a Marxist perspective and a queer perspective. Counterpublics can be understood as a kind of particular parallel formation of a minor or even subordinate character, where other or oppositional discourses and practices can be formulated and circulated, where the classic bourgeois notion of the public sphere, as also being the product, of course, of the 19th century liberal thought, claimed universality and rationality, counterpublics often claim the opposite, and in concrete terms often entails a reversal of existing spaces into other identities and practices, most famously as the employment, of course, as George Chansey has written about, of public parks into cruising areas in gay culture. So here the architectural framework set up for a certain type of behavior remains completely unchanged, but the usage of this framework of the public park is drastically altered. As George Chansey so famously and beautifully put it, privacy could only be had in public. Right? So these very private sexual acts are actually performed in public. Now, according to Michael Warner, who published a book called Publics and Counterpublics, by now very famous, counterpublics has many of the characteristics as the normative and dominant publics, that they exist in a form of imaginary address, a specific discursive formation, we could say, or location, that they involve circulation and reflexivity, and therefore they are always relational as much as they're oppositional. And I think this has, of course, to do with the very notion of self-organization, alternative culture, that, for example, in art history is known as an oppositional form, and certainly one with a lot of credibility. But self-organization does not imply the counterpublic. Indeed, self-organization is, of course, a distinction of any public formation, since the early public formations, as they were known in the 19th century, were self-organized. They were not state-organized. Rather, you could say it's at the moment when the bourgeoisie, and by extension later on the working classes, take over the state apparatus, that the state gets a public role. And moreover, it's something that constructs and posits itself as a public through a very specific mode of address. And in opposition to this, the counter-public is a kind of conscious mirroring of the modalities and institutions of the normative public. So something that's not a library calls itself a public library. So perhaps it should be called the counter-public library, I don't know, we can discuss. Also, again, these are rhetorical issues, so it's a question of strategy, tactics. But did so in order to address other subjects and indeed other imaginaries. So to quote Michael Warner, counterpublics are counter only to the extent that they try to supply different ways of imagining stranger sociability and its reflectivity. As public, they remain orientated to stranger circulation in a way that is not just strategic, but constitutive of membership and its effects. So, of course, what he then talks about in terms of the kind of early semi-public, if you will, queer culture, to enter that discourse, counter-discourse, is comes with a certain risk. Yeah, it's not it's not the kind of modulation that you have in current society, where you do, you know, one day you go to the opera and the next day you go to get a heavy metal tattoo, but rather here, when you enter these spaces, it's something that transforms the subject involved in it. It's not, even though you can enter and leave it, it somehow transforms your subjectivity through the counter-public formation. So, therefore, the last thing I want to talk about is the very notion of instituting. So this counter-public or public library, of course, is a kind of institution, and it seems strange because, as I said before, it was done maybe to reclaim the institution that no longer exists, namely the public library that we know, of course, are closing everywhere. So that is to say, in this sense, that institutions are not just physical structures, but also sites or scenes for instituting, meaning that what an institution does is that it institutes. Sounds obvious. But that they produce certain relations and persist certain ideas and ideologies. Moreover, institutions should not be thought of in this most concrete sense of the term, the actual place, building and function in a given society, but I would say also in the broadest philosophical and political sense. So, institutions are not just practical, or for that matter, sometimes impractical. Certainly in a university you feel that a lot, but they have a practice, or even a praxis. So, what does it then mean to institute? What is being instituted more concretely? Furthermore, there's a particular institutional form, and this also goes for the case of the university, always already institute in a similar way, that is, to institutions of the same type, again as an art institution like this one, entail the same form of instituting. Finally, how does a given institutional form correspond to what is supposedly being instituted? Or in lack of a better term, what we could call what is the institution's content? Theoretically, there is a specific way of looking at this notion of instituting that I would like to discuss in brief. That is how institutions are instituted as institutions, as function and place, and how in turn these institutions then attempt to institute. And here I'm thinking, of course, of the work of Cornelius Castoriadis and his idea of society as an imaginary institution, with actual instituted social imaginaries and relations. As Castoriadis wrote, it is the instituting social imaginary that creates institution in general, the institution as form, as well as the particular institutions of each specific society and the radical imagination of the singular human being. So even that claims it's instituted. So for Castoriadis, famously, society was an imaginary ensemble of institutions, practices, beliefs and truth that members of society subscribe to and thus constantly produce and reproduce. In that sense, society is as much fictional as functional, and institutions are part of a symbolic network, and therefore also not fixed or stable, but constantly articulated through practice and through projection. But of course, the ontological claim in Castoriadis' work is that any society, this is interesting if neoliberalism claims that there is no such thing as society, any society must be instituted as symbolic constructions held together by specific social imaginaries and institutions, which solidifies imaginary signification into what he called the famous term instituted social imaginary. But of course, by focusing on the imaginary character, he obviously also suggests that other social organizations and interactions can be imagined and therefore instituted. So, in Castoriadis' thought, society is not created through any kind of natural rationalism or historical progressive determinism, but instituted through creation, through imagination. So these meanings and ways of instituting, subjectivity, legality, legal systems, and so on, appear perhaps as a more or less coherent whole, as a totality, but appear so only through practice and belief. But as I said, it also means that if society is instituted through creation, it can also be instituted anew. And as we know, of course, if a particular social imaginary comes to be viewed as inaccurate or obsolete, even false, it will mean the collapse of that given society. The way that historical empires have crumbled and fallen, only to be replaced, in turn, by another imaginary order of society. So, if we follow Cosic thought in his analysis of society as self-created, as existing through institutions, we can then present it as a question of imagining another world, not just of describing this one, but to say that other worlds are indeed possible. And here I think exactly the idea of self-institutionalization appears crucial, not only as an organization of collective experience, as evident in certain both activist and artist groups, but also in the very mode of address that tries to produce these aesthetics, these effects. And this, I think, it's interesting to look at the history of, again, the difference between university and anti-university and free university, and the critique of exactly the norms of universities. And I find it odd, even though I work at a university, that where in 1968 and onwards, the so-called left, whatever that means as an imaginary, or what's left of the left, would be critical of academia, of universities. We now find ourselves in a position where we're supposed to defend it, where we're supposed to defend the university. It's somewhat similar to in the discussion in art institutions, the so-called discussion of new institutionalism, where institutional critique of the 1970s claimed the institution to the problem. We have sort of, in my generation of curators, all of a sudden the belief that the institution is the solution. Right? So we're all of a sudden defending institutions, and even defending state institutions that would have been called ideological state apparatuses just a few decades earlier. Similarly, for example, I was quite surprised as a national citizen of the country of Denmark. A few years ago I was asked by other artists and content producers to sign a petition in support of the National Broadcasting Corporation. And that was quite odd because I had actually done some freelance work there in the 1990s, and I have to say it was extremely it was an extremely unfriendly place to work. It was an extremely conservative institution that had very little interest in so-called alternative culture, and I would say they had only disrespect for it. It was an extremely authoritarian organization. And then, all of a sudden, this is seen at that austerity measures in the National Broadcasting Corporation is a huge infringement on our liberty and creativity, and that we therefore have to defend it at all costs. And personally, again, these are individual choices. I could not sign such a petition. Academia, likewise, is structured around professional norms. But as I said earlier, like Judith Butler has said, such norms have history and limits. And academic freedom must be seen as the product of an ongoing critical scrutiny and reinterpretation of these norms themselves. So it's not just to defend the academy, but also to put it in peril. It is crucial, Judith Butler has argued, to deconstruct and historicize the notion of professional norms in order to create greater freedom for what is called extramural, so this idea you could speak outside of your academy, political speech, and so that the lines between the so-called public good and institutional autonomy are not too rigidly drawn. In other words, it's difficult, impossible even, to imagine real academic freedom without a skeptical approach to the very norms that lies at the heart of what it means to be academic. And moreover, I think, and this is hopefully also what we can discuss in the next few days, we have to think of discursive formation as something that's not only happening in academia, but also in these kind of self-organized alternative practices that also deal with the circulation and production of knowledge. and to look at not only the difference though, but the relationship between authorized forms of knowledge and non-authorized forms of knowledge. And I think that a productive way to look at that is actually to think of an oscillation between the public and the non-public. We might be running out of time, so almost time I left. This has to do with how one constitutes a public as specific. And in that sense, there is not only circulation of discourse, there's also withdrawal from discourse. Now this is sometimes enforced through the economy, through censorship, but it could also at other times be intentional and tactical. So the withdrawal from certain public debates and arenas is what makes an alternative cultural and critical production possible. So in other words, we don't have to defend the university at all costs, obviously. But I think it's not a question of either circulation of discourse or withdrawal, so publicness or concealment, but thinking about the movement between these two movements, heightening their connection. And of course, withdrawal immediately makes people probably think of exodus or exit, which is probably the most exaggerated and misunderstood romantic concept in political theory today. And that of course has to do with how it originates or has been popularized by Michael Hart and Anthony Negri, who used the very religious term exodus as the equivalent of desertion and nomadism in what they called being against, famously in their bestseller Empire. But they write, whereas in the disciplinary era, sabotage was the fundamental notion of resistance, in the era of imperial control, it may be desertion. And they moreover say, this desertion does not have a place, it is the evacuation of the places of power. Right, so here withdrawal, or exodus, is directly political and supplants previous models of resistance, such as sabotage, and it is implied that rather than fighting power head-on, if you will, or the centers of power, symbolically and physically, one must withdraw from power itself, right? So walk away from the structures and subjectivities of global capital. So walk away from the university, walk away from public institutions. But here I think three different forms of withdrawal and mobility are conflated, which is most unfortunate. Nomadism, desertion, and exodus. Because of course, withdrawal is again not only a matter of will, it's also enforced from outside. So some are, if not allowed to exit, they are being expelled, and of course right in the center of societies. And this is something that, of course, unifies, strangely enough, students with homeless, for example. They're basically expelled from parts of society, right, in the middle of public debate. Of course, they've been quite criticized for this romanticism, right, that this idea of political exodus becomes similar to illegal immigrants and refugees. So for this very reason, one should be careful to use such a term as withdrawal. But if we look at Paulo Vino's work, we will see he uses the term exit, which I find more comforting than the notion of exodus, because it also doesn't have the religious connotations. He sees it in connection with the term civil disobedience, as acts of not only protest, but of actual refusal to participate in surplus production and exploitation of labor under the conditions of capital. It is not unproductive, rather, as he said, and this is interesting in the notion of surplus value, according to Björn, exit hinges on a latent kind of wealth, namely the exuberance of possibilities for producing value that is not accountable and not transformable into cultural entrepreneurship. As he writes, defection allows for a dramatic, autonomous and affirmative expression of this surplus, and in this way it impedes the transfer of this surplus into the power of state administration, it impedes its configuration as productive research for the capitalistic enterprise. So basically, withdrawal from a certain type of intellectual labor or physical labor, maybe the one that produces surplus value. Now, of course, this is immediately contradicted by this idea of the circulation of discourse. It is impossible in the long run to sustain an artistic production based only on free labor. But on the other hand, it's a question of how income, however minimal, is distributed. So, to exist outside the state's regulation of your personal economic state, taxes, benefits, and so on, while producing public things, is difficult to sustain over longer periods due to the confluence of economy and governmentality in modern state power. To some extent, of course, the very idea of disappearance and exodus is almost impossible. Furthermore, criticism itself must always have an object, whether in the narrow sense of being an artistic production or an exhibition, or in the more broad sense of societal structures of power, or capitalism as a world system of governance and exploitation. So, one's stance as an intellectual or artist must define its position not just in terms of ideology, I think, but also in terms of methodology, in terms of the angle that you use and a certain notion of vicinity. In that sense, rather than positing a dichotomy between inside and outside, I would propose the oscillation between the two, the oscillation between circulation and withdrawal, and to do so in two ways, because it's not just that oscillation, but it's rather something that happens both in the voluntary sense, acts at will, and in the enforced sense, you can be forced out. And each of them are equally political, but nonetheless related. So rather than defending, or for that matter, the university or bemoaning its fate, I would argue that politically and aesthetically, it should always be in question. The academy must remain in peril, not evacuated, or allowed to be appropriated by specific modes of governmentality and economics, but nonetheless be in constant crisis, actually. Likewise, I would not like to romanticize the idea of the alternative too much, but rather to take the idea of alternative cultural production and discursive formation to task for its publicness and its instituting of social relations, and therefore ask both the sanctified places of knowledge and the unauthorized places of knowledge production the very same question. And I'll end with these two questions, which are: how will you govern? And indeed, how do you institute? Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much for that very interesting and very dense and very brilliant lecture. Maybe to start with the first question. So, in a way, I would say it's not so much the question how an institution or an academy or an academic machinery is constructed, but that it somehow gets entangled with disobedience, with disagreement, with conflict. And I see here very much this figure of the unallowed use, of the unauthorized use of knowledge very much. And of course I see there very much the artist also. And then there was this, and then you try to avoid that, but there was this try of the entanglement between art and academy, which was called artistic research, which to my point of view really failed. Do you see any chance of another restarting, reconfiguration of this sort of entanglement? Do you see that?
Well, I think, it's again, this is a communication, this is of course also public talk, so there's a lot of stuff going on in education and in academies that one should probably not talk about in public. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's just say the students break the rules all the time. And I think the system cannot work if people don't not just bend the rules, but break the rules all the time. And I'm not here talking about how they change themselves, but actually to work as productive machines. The same way that in the Fordist era, the machines didn't work properly unless workers modified them and put chewing gums in certain places and so on. Right? That made their labor easier, but it also meant that production was flowing. So I think that universities do function that way, and they function, of course, when we're talking about the distribution of text. This is, of course, one of the major issues. Yeah, so I think that all departments use their virtual learning environment with certain texts, and then there are texts that are circulating in other ways because you don't have the copyright. So you can't post them on your virtual learning environment, but you still circulate. And it's just one example. So I think that entanglement is actually already there in the institution itself. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I want to say anything on artistic research. Let's just say again. I would just say it's a condition. So that happens, of course, with the Bologna process, and it's really a condition of education. I know that in Germany, as a federal state, it's dependent on which part of the country we're in, how these things are being implemented or not. But in the most of the rest of Europe, this is not the case, and so those are the condition that there is PhD level. And if that's the condition, my position is simply then artists could as much do a PhD as anybody else. So in that sense, we have to find out what we mean by artistic research in many ways, but hopefully in a way that comes from the practice rather than from, if we're talking about discursive formations, something that's implemented from outside, or even from something happening alongside it. So it would be nice if it happened from within the discipline of artistic production itself.
Well, I would like to maybe I'm wrong, but I have had, there was, when you mentioned the mail art as one of the models, where was already the first situation of an internationalization, and maybe what we call nowadays networking. But as far as I understood, the main medium of the mail art was the postcard.
Yeah, things in the mail, yeah.
So, well, but it was not the letter. It was mostly something which had the structure of that the interface which was sent from the one to the other was more or less visible for the apparature who organized the transfer of this medium. And there is a strong imagination at this time, from a German context like Wolfgang, that this medium was transmitted by a state organization which we call the Post. And I would ask for this also, because for me it takes that very often as an example, but it's came in a moment where one example is the way how we address a critique, how we go from private to public, heavily changed. That you could say 5-6 years later, the main companies who transfer this mail art were not longer state organizations, they were private ones.
Yeah, well, that happens, of course, a lot later. So I think that the mail art movement in the main is defunct by the early mid-1980s. When one can then discuss what the reasons are for that. But of course, there was this idea of hiding in plain sight. So if you were sending a letter from a country that has strong censorship to a country without censorship, then the chance of that being intercepted is higher than if it's just a postcard. And so yeah, in that sense, I think you're right that it did actually take advantage of the idea of a public system that was functional, and but of course at the same time we don't know how much was lost in the mail and how much was intercepted. We have no idea of knowing. But My main use of it as an example is, of course, this idea that it's equally accessible for all who are in it, but only for those who are in it. That it was not meant to be exhibited, and as a matter of fact, it wasn't really exhibited until the Sao Paulo Biennial in '83, which had a huge section on Medak.
And this collection.
Yeah. So it's a strange phenomenon in that sense, because there is no kind of if there is an institutional support, it's then the mailing system. It's not an institution of art that is the support system for it. And of course, you have then the similarity to the notion, particularly of post-internet art, I think, even though the politics are quite different. But there's similar claims that it somehow exists outside of certain systems of validation. It's only partially true, but at the same time, of course, it's totally dependent on a specific industry of transmission.
I wanted to ask something about the way in this specific conditions of freedom and control, you see how relations with, let's say, extra academic research are being built. I mean, I've noticed that in the last few years, the academia in stress has been taking up lots of energy for its own survival, often at the expense of research that is not defined according to academic norms.
Yeah.
So can you see where, let's say, potentially other types of research are starting to happen in a sort of generous relationship with academia?
Yeah, I mean, it of course happens outside of academia. And I think it should. So the academic disciplines will have to, as they relate to other political changes, they have to relate to other types of knowledge as well. But the only way that one can do that, of course, is then through this idea of unlearning your own norms of professionalization. And there, I suppose that culture and artistic production is a good example of that, because there's constantly things happening that challenge what we think culture is. There's constantly subcultures, even if they're commodifiable, they're still there, and therefore require a response from the methods of, say, academic analysis. Yeah, I think that's why cultural studies was invented. Now maybe we think cultural studies is, old-fashioned, but nonetheless.
Thanks for the talk. My question is, in the beginning you were describing these control mechanisms in the university, which are mainly formal ones, I understand, like quantifiability of knowledge production, student numbers, all related to finances and so on and so forth. I assume there is no control or, in the sense of censorship on content. So I imagine you teaching in such a super controlled system that kind of leads to a sort of schizophrenic situation, and I would like to elaborate you to a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think let's just say that the juries are still out on that one, because you do see, I would say, not so much in the UK, but particularly in the United States, you do see a direct censorship in terms of what you can teach and not teach. You also see it actually you see also a right-wing backlash towards what in education in Europe. You certainly see it in Hungary, but you also see it in less with the universities at the moment, but certainly with changes in primary school, Well, the discussion is it should no longer be religion, it should be Christianity that's taught, for example. We see that in a lot of European countries. So there is that happening. Now, if we look at the universities in the UK, I would say it has an indirect aspect to it, namely that if the main funding came from research profiles of academics, now these research profiles are only relevant in the sense that they can attract students. That's how the funding flows. That will inevitably lead to changes in the monthly research. It would have to. Now, whether that's a good or a bad thing is another discussion, but it would have to alter, which is what I call this kind of, self-censorship, if you will. You would have to alter. You would have to think of what is it in your research and in your teaching that is attractive. And that, of course, can be many things. But it also means, and I think that's the other side of it, it's that, of course, you can bemoan this idea of service provision, but at the same time, it also means that you have to be in a different relationship to those you teach, and therefore in a different position of authority, and you have to reconsider whom your research positions are for. And so, of course, if you're thinking that that's autonomous, then that is complicated. But if you think of it in terms of having a public role, I think it's slightly different. So, I don't have a problem, personally, with offering, let's say, ideas of complication into the teaching at this moment. But I will have a problem if there's not a student interested in the longer run, for sure. Yeah, then I will have a problem. But the irony is that at my particular college, we don't have a problem with recruitment. But again, it depends on the program. So our program probably offers, at least nominally, something you can recognize as a profession. And I think a lot of art schools do that. And of course, art history does it, curatorial programs does it. But where it's getting more complicated is to study something like the program that's also at my university called Art and Politics. And that might be, those kind of programs might have complications, particularly with attracting students. So do we then think within these things that are nominally more clear-cut in terms of the profession, do you then think of that as an experimental space? Or do you think that means a shrinkage of the possibilities? Again, I think both are equally likely scenarios. And that happens in the individual context, in the individual institution, and through the individuals that act in these institutions.
Thank you for this. For the rich talk, I guess. I feel that there are so many points that would deserve delving into and discussing, but just two thoughts. First, to the notion of public and viewing it through the point of view of discursive formation. I think that if one looks at the notion of the public within liberal capitalist democracies, you have to ascertain that there are two conditions for the public to exist, or there are its external limits. One is the continuation of conditions for economic or capitalist accumulation, and the other one would be the stability of political system. So, provided that, I think that discussing counter-publics would require a bit more than just looking at the discursive formations. They would have to provide for some piercing throughs or entries into beyond the limits of what defines the public. So in a way, I think that when discussing counterpublics, we should also discuss the material conditions and the forms of production that go into those discursive formations and not discursive formations themselves only. And I think that, for instance, the writings of Bugge and Neck do provide early on some understanding of that a counterpublic necessarily has to have its own mode of production of the channels of public discourse, and then be able to have a form of production that reflects its own conditions. And then the other thought would be that institutions are, or institutionings are significant insofar as they can, politically significant, related to counterpublics, insofar as they can, A, provide some form of collective action that goes beyond the immediate remit of the institution, and second, provide some form of material resources for this to be sustained over a longer period of time, which in a way contradicts to the position of institution that has to remain within the limits of stable political system and there being an economy that allows for taxation in order for the public institutions to exist. So I think that that's an adage I would add to what you explained in order to understand how institutionings and counterpublics might be related. So in that sense, there might also be the critique of self-organizing. One example is when you look at the political effectivity of self-organized political action, I think it's very limited compared to, for instance, capacity of unions to organize huge number of people and to have, at least ideally, their action reflecting the decisions taken collectively or taken through a model of representation. So I think that's something that really is a challenge for institutionings that are self-organized and that aspire to be transformative in a political sense. So how do you go beyond your institutional remit, and how do you create material resources for this expanded field of action to be sustained over a long time or a long period?
Yeah, I think, you know, with Neck and Kluge, again, it's written in a particular historical moment and in one particular society. But what I think we can draw from them is that they refute, of course, and I have time to go into this today, but they refute, of course, the spatial allocation of what's considered public in the bourgeois model and in capitalist society, which is basically excludes the economy, right? So also that you would also find that in Habermas, that economic decisions are private decisions. So they say it's not just about the marketplace and media, but actually the factory is a public space because it's a place that institutes social relations. I'm translating them into Castre's terms. You probably wouldn't like that. But anyway, and the same for the school, and the same for education. They are actually public in the sense that if we buy public space means place for the formulation of political visions and for political action, then we have to expand those spaces. And then I think if one is to use that model, of course, it needs to be adjusted historically, because those spaces are not the same. We would have to then analyze virtual spaces, and we would have to analyze this in terms of the supernatural. And that I think also has, there I'm not so sure I share your optimism on behalf of trade unions, but that is also how they, of course, are conditioned on, have been conditioned on a specific compromise / conflict between capital and labor that played itself out in nation states with certain rules, certain laws, certain taxation, so the union could, in those contexts, put pressure on how capital was distributed. This is, of course, not the case when capital moves transnationally the way it does. I don't think we need to go into that, but that's why I'm not so sure what a transnational union would mean, since I see unions as being specifically tied to specific legal bodies or state legislation. But it's an interesting thought if they would do that. The second potential problem I of course see with unions is that they are trade unions, so they define themselves according to profession, and each profession are in the same boat with their professional peers, or we could say those who share a professional norm, and not with anybody else. So it's easy to play a game of divide and conquer in terms of trade unions. And again, to use an example from, there was renegotiations of salaries in the universities in the UK this year, and austerity measures rule. So, and even though it's privatized, they're afraid of not being able to recruit. So the university suggested that the salaries for all staff should increase by 1%, which of course does not in any way correspond to the rising living costs. At the same time, they agreed in the UK that the SMT, senior management team of all universities, should have an increase of 9%, which of course, sometimes you wonder in terms of the political language games, why on earth they're trying to say to people, you should only get 1% and then give themselves 9%. It's not, in terms of PR, it's not a very clever thing to do. So obviously there was uproar, but then again what happened was that each union would do their own negotiations. So in the end what happened was that the union for academics, in my union, were offered 2%. And so the union voted on it and said that 2% is better than 1%, so we cancelled the strike. But everybody else got 1%, and SMT still got 9%. So, there was like, they were saying, SMT, our work is apparently more important than yours. And we were saying that our work is more important than the work of the secretaries and janitors and technical staff, because they only got 1% and we got 2%. And of course the academics, in terms of class composition, they have middle-class aspirations, and they're all, again, talking about this notion of indebtedness. Everybody has a mortgage. A lot of them have children who they are trying to save up money for educating, for getting an education, so they're completely entangled. Despite all the ideologies that people may have, they were completely entangled in the neoliberal economy, and so therefore it was a clear situation of taking the 2%. At the same time, by the way, all my students said, can you please not go on strike, because we don't want to not get our degrees. So this is the reality of the situation. And actually, in my particular university, it was one of the two in the whole country where there was quite a lot of support for continuing the strike. So this was even supposed to be the most radical college, one of the most radical colleges. So anyway, I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent. It's not answering your question properly.
Yeah, I didn't have a romanticized ideal view of trade unions. I was just saying that they have capacity to mobilize much larger than what self-organized efforts sometimes provide, particularly in the field of culture.
Well, we'll continue that.
I would suggest that
we have one more question over there. And so, if there are others, we stay. Can you stay?
I'm going to stay there for a long time. As Tommy said before me, that was a talk that covered a lot of topics that would deserve more attention. And whatever questions you get, I'm just going to focus on a small point of it. In my case, the small point was maybe the last 30 seconds of the talk when you asked two very precise questions that I imagine to be directed towards future, towards what's happened next. The questions, how do you govern and how do you institutionalize? And I mean, I'm in no way in a position to give a definitive answer of that, but as everyone here, I'm in this room of internet stuff from the last 2 years, or 5 years, maybe even 15 years in some cases, or 20. How do you govern? I think what the past of this experience at least tells us, and I mean, most of the part of your talk falls for me under the table because I'm not in education. I'm not asking about education. I'm not at the receiving end of education, I'm not at the producing end. I'm just at the moment looking at this. I'm thinking like, how do you govern? How did this govern? How did this become? And from HTTP to SMTP to Napster to BitTorrent to communities around BitTorrent, it seems to me the simple answer to your first question would be how this governed was by protocols. By establishing protocols where you can say, if you speak my protocol, you're part of my horizon. If you speak a different protocol, if you want to have a dialect, let's see how we get along. We can establish a border regime, but the governor was through, it seems to me, through protocol. Technical protocol, like BitTorrent, which governs still today. And how do you institutionalize? There's one technical term, I think.
It's actually institute, not institutionalized.
How do you institute?
But okay. It's quite different for me, but yeah.
Do you have a 30-second explanation of the difference? Then I'm going to modify my question.
Well, by institutionalized, that would be, of course, university. That for me means to put it into an existing institutional form. By instituting, I simply means the possibility of placing social relations and subjectivity in a form.
Okay.
So that's what I'm. So it's a broader.
Okay. I picked up a technical term recently that comes, or not recently, like quite some time ago. To me, it's a computer science term, but it comes from agriculture, and it's called, or from city planning, if you will. It's called paving the cow paths. It's like what Brendan Ike, the inventor of JavaScript, will tell you if something can be added to JavaScript or not. He's very conservative on that and says, but we may be paving the cow paths, which means you have laid out your streets, you have laid out your kind of grid, you have the grid of institutions, but maybe at some time you observe that your citizens, the cows, are taking different pathways because your grid doesn't align with them, and then paving the cow paths, like making this other grid by observing the actual pathways of the citizen or the subject, you actually, and that's where the institution, or in the case of JavaScript, it's even more horrible because they're a standard body. How do you extend the standard? Maybe by just looking where the cows walk, and then these two questions to me seem to be much easier to answer than a lot of the education. But I have one last remark. There's the recurring trope, it occurred in your talk, of what's left of the left. And I find it so stunning that what's left of the left is 99% of the time understood as temporal. What's left of the left in time. Maybe you should all be looking what's left of the left in, if that's our political geography of space, then what's left of the left in space. In politics, not in time.
No, I agree with that last point. So, yeah, I mean, this, of course, governing by protocol, that's, of course, what always happens. So, is it then possible to imagine, the kind of governmentality that rewrites protocols? Or do you simply use, protocols that are defined technologically, institutionally? That I think would be the key question for me in that, but again, it's probably going a bit too far for this evening. And in terms of instituting, I think it's more that, I think that whatever is counter-publics, these ideas are to some extent relational, towards power, but at the same time I think they will have to think of how to implement their own structures, their own social forms. And this is, of course, what you find in Castellarius, but this is also what I think was always Foucault's question, namely to the left at the time. He said, I understand your critique, and I probably share your critique of capital, but what I want to know is, since he saw the main problem being governmentality, discipline, punish, etc., how you govern. And this is, I think, one of the issues that, of course, we still have to answer, even if, particularly if we're communists, whether that's with a small or a big C. You know, that's exactly the question that one must then think about, to me.
I would. Well, this is the very, very final.
I'm an architect, so for me governing is always an issue of design, not only of, but at least. But what I actually wonder is, don't you think that discussing the issue of knowledge and reducing it to academia is really difficult? Because, let me elaborate. Because if it is about reclaiming spaces and reclaiming how we govern, who drafts the protocols or designs the spaces, how we govern and how we communicate and everything, the academia in a state of crisis that you have described, although at one point you said a very nice sentence, and even noted it down, that the task of academia is always to question it itself. But somehow to open up the discussion about infrastructure of knowledge by reducing it to academia, for me it seems a bit starting from looking at the dead end. Maybe we need to turn our backs to the dead end and open up this space. Especially because we are sitting in something that's not necessarily part of academia.
No, I don't think I'm reducing anything to academia. Quite the contrary. I think that there are knowledge productions happening outside academia all the time. So it's more a question of how can academia respond to that or not. Now, of course, I have to say, in my defense, I was asked to talk from the point of view of academic education and what are the threats to knowledge production or not at this very moment. So, I could have talked about other things as well. So this is the reason. It's not that I want to defend or reclaim academia particularly. Quite the contrary, it's important to think of the oscillation between academic knowledge and other forms of knowledge all the time. And I would hope that academics do that. But the question is, can they do that without being academics? And that I don't think you can. That I don't think is possible. Then you have to leave academia, of course. So to speak within the university of other forms of knowledge, you can only do as an academic. That may transform the discipline of academia, or it may transform you, so you leave. These are all possible outcomes. But they will have to be, decided and according to a number of factors. So, moreover, I think for me that the tactical thing must be to both think of publicity, engagement with existing institutions, and the withdrawal from them. So to think of that in a movement, and not to say, let's abandon these structures, they're worthless, and let's do our own thing. Because I think, one of course, and then we can then start talking about how cultural production, so-called alternative cultural production, is related to cultural entrepreneurship, because one of the claims of neoliberalism is, yes, go do it yourself. Don't expect the state to do it for you. We're more than happy if you get rid of all human sciences, and do it yourself, maybe in smaller art spaces. That's fine. Yeah, we welcome.
Okay, yeah, just as one sentence, I think in this 3 days, now it's almost only 3 days, the question about the academic machinery is quite important because it's a big machinery and it's not the only one, but we have to demand something out of it. That's my position and also why I think that these contexts are also important in our discussion. And I think that tonight there is a big variety of points that we can discuss on the next day. So I think it was very good starting point to keep all that open questions for the next day. So thank you again very much.
Thank you.